Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's show is all about a topic that's rarely discussed: trust. Although trust is a basic, intuitive human reaction, and it should play a major part in a well functioning society, it is at an all time low in our personal relationships, business institutions, governments, healthcare, and law enforcement. Fewer people attend a place of worship than at any time in the last century. Citizens fear their votes are not being counted and that politicians are simply con artists who are lying to them. Some people believe that our system of democracy itself has no legitimacy. Millions of people refuse to take life saving vaccines because they don't trust what medical professionals and the media are telling them. In law enforcement and the justice system, a lack of trust motivates non cooperation, fear, and a breakdown in law and order. In fact, in 2020, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, stated that trust is at a breaking point and could have profound implications for international cooperation because without it, humanity cannot survive. Today's guest believes we're facing an unprecedented trust deficit crisis. He wrote his PhD thesis on building trust in hostile environments, and he's dedicated his career as an executive coach to teaching leaders how to effectively build trust in their relationships. He's a professor at the Luxembourg School of Business, teaching in their MBA and executive education programs. His new book, entitled Building Trust: Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, outlines his groundbreaking, practical, and insightful methodology for building trust, which he calls the Trust Unlimited model. He's been described as a trust savant because he's one of the world's leading experts on diagnosing critically important trust problems for individuals, teams, and organizations at the highest level, and helping them to create a path to move forward in a positive and constructive way. I'm delighted to welcome Darryl Stickel to our show. Darryl, thank you so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure to be with you today, Harvey.
Darryl, I want to start by asking you where your fascination with the concept of trust comes from.
That's a good question, and it stems from my life growing up. I was born and raised in a small town in northern Canada, Fort St. John, and it was fairly isolated and remote. And there was a sense that we had to pull together. There was a sense of community and this underlying notion that if you could help people, you should. And I took that with me through the rest of my life. And I had a set of experiences when I was young. My father was badly injured when I was about 7 years old. He was involved in an automotive accident, lost his leg, cracked his pelvis, broke his hip, crushed a couple of vertebrae in his back, and he was in pain for the rest of his life. And he managed that. He self-managed that with alcohol. And so he and I had struggles, partly because I was visually impaired from a very young age. Now, my eyesight got worse. I'm now legally blind, and I knew I was going blind. And so I had decided that I needed to train my brain to be able to think for a living. And my father had a grade 8 education. He had a hard time understanding me. And so that led to a lot of conflict and a lot of struggles. I probably didn't help matters much, but it led to an understanding of how to cause pain and a desire on my part not to do that. And when I was 17, I was playing junior hockey and I got attacked by a fan with a club. Almost killed me. And now all of a sudden I'm someone who wants to train his brain to think for a living, and I can't think. I have the attention span of a fruit fly. And I learned what it was like to be helpless and hopeless and to struggle, to lose a sense of self, those kinds of things. And it provoked a sense of empathy in me, an understanding for others. And so, when I went to university in Victoria, I'd be sitting on the bus and someone would just sit down next to me and say, I'm really having a hard time. And for some reason, people felt comfortable opening up to me. And I wanted to understand what that was and what drove it.
Darryl, why do you think that trust is at an all time low in our society?
So I believe that trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. And when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. And the first is, how likely am I to be harmed? And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad's it going to hurt? And those things multiply together to give us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. And so that means that if uncertainty is high, then vulnerability has to be low. So early in relationships. But as that relationship gets deeper, then the level of uncertainty starts to decline. The range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And if we think about what's going on in society, our vulnerability isn't going down, Harvey, but uncertainty is all over the place. And, we've seen active steps taken to reduce trust in media. We've experienced pandemics where the rules were changing, and partly they had to change and evolve because we didn't really understand the virus to start with. And as our understanding grew and developed, then the recommendations we were getting evolved and changed. And we had different rules for different companies, different communities, different regions, different countries, and they were a moving target. And so that provoked a lot of uncertainty. We're seeing technological change. We're seeing change in norms and values. None of these are bad things in and of themselves. They make it really hard for us to be comfortable being vulnerable.
You wrote that trust building, even though it's not your fault, is still your problem. What did you mean by that?
Right. This is particularly true for the context. Sometimes we are constrained by the context, or there's something historical that has happened that is not within our control, is not something we contributed to, but we still need to address it and deal with it. So, for example, you were a judge and you were an advocate for the legal system, and I suspect you still are. Okay, so there are some problems within the legal system. So we look at the U.S. Supreme Court, where we see people being placed in those roles without no one even believes that they're going to be unbiased or objective. It's become so politicized. There is no expectation of them being what most of us would think is a good judge, weighing the evidence. And what they showed us, because all of them were asked about Roe versus Wade, what they showed us is that they're really smart and that they can justify any decision they choose to come to. And that's troubling. And as someone who's an advocate for the justice system, that isn't your fault, but it is your problem to deal with when you're trying to build trust with others who have run into bizarre situations with the legal system.
Yeah, that's a good example. In your book, you discuss the traditional approach of influencing people's willingness to trust, which you call the con artist's tactic. What's the
Right.
difference between that and your trust model?
Yeah. So there's a lot of people who are trying to move that risk propensity, that willingness to be vulnerable, that willingness to accept risk. And they talk about influencing people's neurology. And we've got a long history of this. There's a long history of getting people to make decisions they later regret. It's called alcohol. And I'm really uncomfortable with us getting people to be more vulnerable than they would otherwise be comfortable being. And so the approach that I take is, how do we communicate effectively to close the gap between how much we should be trusted and how much we actually are? And part of that comes from self-awareness. Part of that comes from including the other person in the conversation. Part of it comes from actions that we can take to be more trustworthy. And so from my perspective, it's really about understanding where uncertainty comes from and taking steps to reduce that, understanding the other party's sense of vulnerability, and taking steps to help them manage that or mitigate it in some way. So it's about creating safer places for people so that we can have the conversations we're struggling to have.
Darryl, you've helped leaders build trust in a wide range of business and personal environments, including the Canadian military in Afghanistan. Can you tell us a little about your work with the military?
Yeah, the military came to me and acknowledged that they'd been in Afghanistan for years and there'd been no economic development at all. And what they realized was that trust levels were so low, people weren't willing to invest in anything. And what we've seen from research is that economies that have higher trust levels tend to grow more quickly. Countries with higher trust levels have stronger economies. Organizations with higher trust levels tend to do better. Higher returns to shareholders, higher employee engagement, higher retention, more referrals, all those kinds of things. It's a social lubricant. Well, go to Afghanistan and there's no strong central government. It's a group of people who have been, helped by outside forces multiple times, and it's never really been to their benefit. And so they're no longer willing to invest in things that have a future payoff. So no one's getting education. No one's trying to become a mechanic because there's probably no cars to fix. And if there were, no one could afford to pay them to fix them. But you do become very interesting for the Taliban because now you've got a set of skills that they could use. People are growing poppy, not because they want to grow poppy, but because that's the only crop you can get a bank loan for. And it's the only crop you can get a bank loan for because it's hardy. You don't need to rely on irrigation, which looks a lot like infrastructure, which people are blowing up all the time. If you grow vegetables and you try to take them to market, you run into 5 roadblocks on the way to market. And half of them are manned by bandits, the other half by the military. If you go the next week, it's the same group of people, but they've just switched uniforms. So one day I'm a bandit, next day I'm in the army. But they charge you a toll or force you to pay them at every roadblock. And then you get to market and people say, hey, you can't afford to take these back. I'm going to offer you 20% of what they're worth because you got nowhere to store them and you're stuck. But if you grow poppy, people come to you to pick up the product. And so they decided that they wanted to create pockets of stability where economic growth could actually start to take place. And the thing that they said to me was, we know this isn't going to work because we're too late, but it's a practice for the next time that we run into a situation like this, because we're thinking that this will be like an ink blot experience where we create a small zone, pocket of safety, economic development starts to take place, take root, and then people become invested in that and want to see it in other parts of the country. And so we'll have the approval to actually move. I learned a lot helping the Canadian military, and part of that was that context is really a big deal. Not a lot of the research had talked about context, and context are the formal and informal mechanisms of social control that constrain our behavior, right? And so a lot of times when I work with companies or with groups, I'll say, if you could be anywhere doing anything with anyone at this moment, how many of you would be here listening to me speak? And I stopped doing that, Harvey, because it wasn't good for my self-esteem, because no hands would go up, right? Everyone could think of someplace they'd rather be. And I would say to them, well, then why are you here? It was the context. And what I came to realize helping the Canadian military was that when we don't know someone, context is a powerful driver of our decision to trust them. And one guy with a machine gun looks a lot like another guy with a machine gun. And so we tended to rely on formal mechanisms of social control really heavily because we've got strong central government and all these, we've got a democracy and we've got rules and regulations that are enforced and contracts that can be enforced and all of those things. They had none of that. And so it was all informal mechanisms of social control. It was, who do you know? Who are you related to? What religion do you belong to? What village are you from? Those were the things that mattered. And so it took us a while to figure this out and it seems obvious in retrospect. But, a lot of the trust literature doesn't account for context or the fact that we sometimes trust people without knowing anything about them. You go to a doctor's office, they say, take off your clothes, and you do, right? If we change that example to the same 2 people, same dialogue, same clothing, but we move them to a bathroom at a gas station, it goes from credible to creepy in a heartbeat. And so part of how we build trust is by reducing uncertainty. And part of that is through explaining our context, explaining how we're constrained, those kinds of things. And, I think there are 10 levers we can pull. Context is one of them. And in the book, I try to go through systematically and reveal everything. You've read the book. I try to go through and talk about the 10 levers and how we can pull them, because I don't want this to go away if I do.
Well, let me ask you this. We all take a certain amount of risks in life, and sometimes we make mistakes.
Right.
And that's how we learn and grow. But in order to take chances, we have to trust that if we make a mistake, we'll survive. But in
Mm-hmm.
today's world of strict political correctness and social media, where everyone is criticized for their every move, and cancel
Right.
culture is so common, how can people trust enough to take chances?
That's a really good question. And it's a challenge for us to even have conversations now, because the feeling of vulnerability is so high. And I have two sons, they're 21 and 18, two young men that I adore. They are the center of my life. And I tell them, be cautious, be extremely cautious about what you post, because even though it may be okay now, the rules may change in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, and you will be held accountable for the thoughts and beliefs you have now, even if you've changed and grown and developed. One of the challenges we see is that we don't give people the opportunity to evolve and grow and learn and develop. And people are terrified of making mistakes. And so it provokes this sense of anxiety. And as I said, with the uncertainty sort of fluctuating the way it is, our comfort level with being vulnerable has declined.
I'm sure you know the vast majority of couples nowadays meet each other online.
Right.
People can create profiles on dating websites and they can invent all kinds of backstories for themselves that may or may not be true. And because of
Right.
privacy laws, it's very hard to find out whether someone you're dating has a criminal record or whether they're married or bankrupt or whether they're
Oh,
even the person they claim to be. So, at what point does being skeptical in a healthy way become a problematic trust issue?
these, wow, you're really nailing this, Harvey. You're asking me some really good questions.
It's what I'm known
Um,
for.
yeah, so it's a challenge. I mean, we just saw someone elected to government in the US, George Santos, who lied about everything. One of the things that I find helpful about the model that I use is it informs me about the questions that I should be asking. It allows me to ask questions about benevolence and integrity and ability. And it allows me to do that in a way that doesn't provoke defensiveness. And I think we need to be more intentional now than we've ever been around building trust and taking steps to connect with each other. One of the challenges that we face is 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average. And that's not just statistically impossible. It also creates a problem for us, because that means that every time we run into a trust problem, we assume it's somebody else's issue to deal with. And so a lot of times we're stuck in our own story. We interpret the world through stories. We're stuck in our own story. We don't take a moment to think about the other person's story, about what may be going on for them or what questions might arise for them. And we've seen this, people used to be uncomfortable or feel shame when they lied, if they got caught. That seems to be going away. We're seeing people just blatantly lying or twisting the truth in a way that's profoundly uncomfortable, or assuming the worst of people. And so one of the struggles we face is a lot of times people will say, well, I do the things that you talk about. It doesn't matter if I think I do those things. It matters if the other person thinks I do those things. So it has to land for them. And so I need to include people in the conversation. If I'm going to talk about benevolence or integrity or one of the levers that I talk about in the book, I actually have to include the person in the conversation so that I get their perspective as well.
Is there a point in everyone's life when we stop trusting?
Oh, I think we've all had disappointments. We've all had moments where the world has failed us or where someone else has failed us. I think some people react to that differently than others. Some of us become more jaded. Some of us become stronger, right? Sometimes a hard road's a good teacher. Sometimes it's just a hard road. But sometimes we learn from those things about what we can tolerate, what we can stand. And we become less anxious. When I worked at McKinsey and Company, my colleagues would say to me, "You're so calm. Like everything's going wrong and you're so calm." And I thought to myself, yeah, I've experienced worse than this. This is not going to kill me. So there is an element of learning that we go through, and it influences our willingness to accept risk, right? It influences that threshold over time. And so some of us become less trusting and more cynical. Some of us become more aware about what trust is and how it works. And if we're capable of learning those lessons, we can also sometimes learn what might be going on for someone else when we're trying to build trust with them. What might be worrying them? What might be of concern to them?
You wrote about the importance of defining what success looks like in an interaction before it occurs.
Yeah.
How does that increase trust between people?
Well, it acts as a so when I talk about the model that I use, I talk about uncertainty and vulnerability and that risk threshold. That leads to a decision to trust somebody. And part of the challenge we face is when we get to the end of that conversation, when you and I are having an exchange, and we may have the same perception about it or different ones. We interpret the world through stories. But if you and I had agreed before the podcast, what does a good podcast look like? We'd both be pulling in the same direction. And then we could create a shared story about what happened, about whether it was a good podcast or not, whether it met the needs of your guests or not. And so that reduces the likelihood of us having a profound miscommunication, or me feeling like, oh my God, the rules got changed right at the end, or that wasn't what I thought was expected. And so it means that the next time we interact and engage, I've got a positive perspective about the experience, or we have a shared perspective and we can work to make it better. But if we come out of this and one of us thinks it was fantastic and the other thinks it was terrible, it's harder for us the next time we engage.
Right. Well, Darryl, I was very intrigued by what you wrote about the justice system. You said that justice is a tricky thing to unpack, and that's why we have judges. But even they struggle and make mistakes when trying to apply the law fairly. As you know, I'm a retired family and criminal court judge. Do you believe we can learn to be more fair?
I think we can. Part of the challenge that we're facing right now is that a lot of the behaviors we're seeing that we don't like are driven by the context that we've allowed to evolve. I think we can learn to be more fair, and partly it's adjusting the rules of the game. The structures that we have in place right now seem to encourage, particularly around leaders. The role of leaders has become more challenging than it's ever been. It's a moving target. What makes a good leader is a moving target. We seem to have structures in place that encourage people to take those leadership roles who don't always have a strong care and concern for others. They're more motivated by self-interest. And that's because of the structures we put in place. A lot of people that I talk to who are great leaders, I ask them if they would like to be political leaders, and they say, why would I put my family through that? And so we've created this set of rules and conditions that don't serve us well. And I think we're seeing a similar thing play out in court systems, because we actually need to agree what fair looks like. And the research on perceived justice talks about 3 different approaches we can take to a fair division of spoils. One of those is equality-based, everyone gets the same. One of those is need-based, whoever needs the most gets the most. One of those is equity-based, whoever contributes the most gets the most. And if we're not agreeing on what dimension we're using or playing, what rules we're playing by, that's a challenge. And it becomes even more of a challenge if we start thinking about, well, how do we determine who needs the most? Because there's different perspectives on that. How do we determine who contributed the most? because we'll have different evaluations of who did what and how we should value it. And even equality can be hard because people have different ways of measuring who got what, and did people contribute as much as they could. And so our whole discussion around fairness needs to be more intentional than it's been.
In your work coaching executives, how do you deal with situations where the major impediment to a healthy level of trust between individuals is professional jealousy?
Oh, it's a challenge because when we start talking about, benevolence, having the best interest of the group at heart or the best interest of those you lead, people have concerns about the competitive nature of the environment, about who gets rewarded for what. I think once again, we need to try to understand what success looks like for the individual players. And so that requires a conversation. But we also need to start better identifying what good looks like for the organization, for the group. Because, I was working with a company and they were talking about the reward system they had and how some top performers were sort of acknowledging, hey, I didn't do this all on my own. Other people really contributed to this. And I was thinking about the concept of givers and takers. And, we've seen research that tells us that givers provide incredible value, but we don't always identify them correctly. And we don't always value them properly. And so with that organization, I said, well, why don't you start creating an award that people can vote on to say who contributes the most to the team's overall success? Not the person who achieved the outcome that was desired, but the person who's involved in helping everyone else be successful, so that you encourage those sorts of behaviors. And so I think, again, partly it's how do we structure the context so that we're all pulling in the same direction? We're all pulling on the same rope. We all have the ability to be successful.
Many of the methods that you discuss in your book to gain trust can take a lot of time. Sometimes we don't have a lot of time and we're forced to make a quick decision in a pinch about whether to trust someone. What do you suggest in that situation?
Yeah, so I think, the model is helpful in terms of what questions to ask. A lot of times we have this lack of awareness about trust. We don't know who we trust or how much we trust them. In our heads, trust feels like a dichotomous variable. It feels like it's either present or absent. It feels like a light switch. And in reality, we trust some people more than others. So there are questions we can ask about the level of vulnerability we're experiencing and can it be reduced? There are questions we can ask to reduce our uncertainty. Or, we can decide to sort of step out of that engagement and say, yeah, I'm not comfortable and here's why. One of the initial challenges, sometimes we'll feel this feeling in the pit of our stomach, like I'm uncomfortable. And we don't know what to do in those moments. So we don't always identify a trust problem as one until after our trust has failed. And when we do properly identify it, we don't quite know what to do. And that's what I try to do in the book is lay out a systematic approach to understanding some of these things. We can build trust fairly quickly with others, and I've seen it happen. Partly it comes from being a bit vulnerable ourselves, to initiate a norm of reciprocity from someone else to get them to act in the same way. And so what I advise for folks is small amount of vulnerability. So maybe explaining why you're uncomfortable, followed by an act of benevolence. And so wanting to understand what the other party's interests are, how they can be successful. And so it may be as simple as saying, I'm kind of uncomfortable and here's why. What are you trying to achieve? And when the other person says, this is what I'm trying to do, say, well, maybe in future when you're approaching people, you could explain it this way. Or have you thought about trying it this way? So helping them hopefully be more successful in the future, which may well initiate a response back to you of saying, how can I help you make this decision easier?
I want to tell our viewers that you can learn more about Darryl Stickel and his Trust Unlimited program by going to his official website, trustunlimited.com. Well, Darryl, I have only one more question for you.
Yeah,
Do you have faith that we can ever become a more trusting society?
I absolutely do. Trust is, I've seen too many profoundly positive impacts occur in the work that I've done. I wrote the book because I felt like I was dropping grains of sand in the ocean, and I wanted people to come alongside and pick up great big rocks with me to make a difference. And I think the ability to build trust is something we can be intentional about. It's something we can work towards. It's a skill like any other that we can hone. And I hope people don't just buy the book. I hope they read it and apply it.
Well, Darryl, I've really enjoyed this opportunity to discuss a topic that, in my opinion, really needs to be better explored and understood. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Thanks, Harvey. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your audience.
Our guest has been Darryl Stickel, author of Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, which is available wherever books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver, my wonderful managers, Rick and Robin at the Marcelli Company in Hollywood, and my entire team at XPTV1 in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.